And that word at the top, consider. And I did. I considered what to title this lesson. It seemed like a good word, but I wanted to put more. And then forgot to tell Tricia that I was going to put more. And I'm really glad that I didn't, because I really like that as a title now that I've fully fleshed out the lesson, and I really feel more comfortable with what's going on. I like the word consider, because considering is a good thing to do. And it's something people need to do more often. It's something that I need to do more often. Take the time to think about something. And there's a number of words in the New Testament and the Old that use that concept. The word meditate, the word think, the deduce, to consider. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, this is something that the writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, is going to do a lot. He's going to consider. And again, we'll use the same analogy that we've been using all along, as I feel almost like Solomon is going through town. And from time to time, he sees something interesting. Almost window shopping, you might say, but he's window shopping for wisdom. That would make a great title. Window shopping for wisdom. Okay. If I ever write a book on Ecclesiastes, that's what I'm titling it. But anyway. And that's what he's doing. He's kind of looking around and he sees this. And he's looking for wisdom. And he sees these guys over here working. And there must be something to this work thing. Something that Solomon didn't really experience all that much of lately. He was more in the planning phase than the work phase. The telling people what to do phase. And so he was good at that. And he sees these guys working and he wonders. And he considers their actions. Is there any longevity in it? Is there anything worthwhile in it? Is there anything that does not constitute vanity in it? And he comes to the conclusion that no, even the structures that he himself commissioned being built, to be fair, had built, they're going to be destroyed one day. They're not going to exist, and they're not going to bring any long-standing joy or pleasure. And so there's a futility in it, a vanity in it. And he goes on, and he deals with the priesthood, and he deals with himself in the kingship, and he deals with all of these different places. And so he spends his time considering, and he talks a lot about stopping and thinking and wondering. And then here in verse 13, he gets to the point where he's got to consider something more important than just earthly concepts. And he's still under the sun, so you have to remember that he's still from a certain perspective. But notice what he says here in verse 13. Consider the work of God. For who can make straight what he has made crooked? And you might say, well, why in the world would he make something crooked? Well, if you're God and you can make it straight, why wouldn't you make it straight? And I know the perfectionist, the completionist out here, that we're wondering that question. We're wondering why. Why would you make it crooked, God? Why would you do that? And I think the first thing that came to my mind was a dog leg on a golf course. Now, I don't know if this is why, but the golf course in Logansport, at least the one I was allowed to go to, because the other one I was not allowed to go to, I didn't have a membership to that club, and but the cheap one, let's just call it what it is, it was a par 3 course, and that's all the space they had. And the way they made it slightly more interesting on hole 8 was they included a dog leg. And the only thing different about a dog leg from a regular hole is that normal holes go straight towards the hole, especially on a par 3, because you're practically going to, hopefully, get there on one shot. A dog leg is an intentional complication. You can't shoot it straight at the hole, even though at this one you could, because especially in the spring before the leaves started, their forest that was supposed to get in the way didn't really. And you could shoot through the forest and hope that it didn't hit a tree, and you were fine. But you were supposed to go up to a way station, effectively, and then over to the hole. It was to give just an added difficulty, just an added complication to it, and to make it slightly more classy. This very cheap, very restrictive par 3 course. It was great. It was great. The dog leg was designed for your enjoyment, not for you to cheat. Not so that you could get one stroke lower by cheating through the dog leg and getting to the hole that much faster. In competition, if there ever were a competition at that cheap golf course, you would be disqualified for cheating. But the weird thing is that I saw a lot of people cheating when they were just playing a round of golf for fun. Why do you cheat when you're there to have fun? Like, it's not good to cheat anyway, let's be fair here. But at least from a worldly perspective, that makes sense. If there's money on the line, if you're trying to get some fame or, something out of it. But if you're just playing with friends, that's like saying that the fish you caught was this big when it was actually this big. Nobody cares, right? So you scored one lower. But you could have just said that you scored one lower. You didn't have to cheat the dog leg. And when you do that, all you really do is cheat yourself of the experience, of the challenge, of one less stroke as you're going through the golf course. And it makes no sense. And that's almost like what Solomon is looking at. People who take shortcuts on things that were intended to be slightly longer for the enjoyment or for the practicality or for something. And he said, well, then I started thinking about the Bible. Always also a good thing to do. I started thinking about the Bible and situations in the Bible where God has His people do something that doesn't seem necessary. And maybe they don't really understand it. Maybe I still don't understand it. But He does that. And I thought of the routes, especially during the Exodus and coming into the Promised Land. They crossed the Red Sea. And the Israelites, as we see there, what in the world are you doing? Right? Why did we come to the Red Sea? We've got the Red Sea at our back and we're staring down the Egyptian army. We've got nowhere to go, nothing we can possibly do. An unnecessary complication. And yet God used it to facilitate not only destruction in Egypt, but the salvation of His people. I think about the 40 years of wandering, which was entirely unnecessary, except for the fact that God wanted those first generation all dead. -2. And they needed to be destroyed. They needed to be punished. They needed to die so that the next generation could have the chance to go in fresh. And then it kept going. And I was thinking, and then more and more instances where God put a dog leg in their way. And they didn't have the chance of cheating through it. I mean, it wasn't just a couple of trees in the way. That was a brick wall. They weren't getting through it with a golf ball. And I thought maybe of the most significant one that came to mind would be at the very end of the wilderness wandering as they're coming down along, for you guys it would be this way, the southern border of what would be Israel one day. They come all the way around to the eastern border so they can cross the Jordan to go back west again. They could have just gone up the Gaza Strip and taken the Promised Land without much difficulty, especially with God on their side, and yet God had them go all the way around, circumvent that, so that they could come in on the side of the extra tribes and then cross over to that first city, Jericho. There it is. I kept trying to say Jethro, and that was Moses' uncle, or father-in-law. Anyway, so this dog leg, and why is this dog leg there? In Romans chapter 1, why does God keep doing this? And I kept coming back to the conclusion. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but even when you're talking with God, it's not 20/20, because I don't have the sight God does looking back at the things that He decides. I don't really understand some of the decisions He makes. Some of them become clear as the situation unfolds, and you understand why God had them do a certain thing. And in the same way it was when I was working with my father, there were things that he had me do that didn't make a lot of sense. But then when the step came that really became important, I went, oh, wow, that's why you did that already. And you went ahead and tied this off, or you went ahead and loosened that bolt. Well, this is why. Okay, that makes total sense now. Because he had experience, he had a foresight of what was going to take place, and God has the perfect foresight. In Acts chapter, I'm trying to get ahead of myself here. I need to be in Romans chapter 1. There we go. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. There's this, and there's a number of other places that communicate this concept of God having control. Not only in the specific sense of Him having control of the universe, but more particularly of the situations even in our lives. And he says there in verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. See, them suppressing the truth doesn't change the truth. Them trying to get in the way of the Word of God doesn't hinder the Word of God, not in its factualness, its truthfulness. He says in verse 19, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. He has demonstrated, He has committed Himself to them, and He has revealed Himself to them. In verse 20 he says, For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And I am befuddled by the fact that as intelligent as people feel like they are getting, as much scientific understanding as people are trying to accumulate, they still don't have a great explanation for all of this. For the fact that we are here, other than, well, it couldn't be any other way. Well, that's not a very good argument. Not really. Well, if there were any other way, then we wouldn't be here and some other people would. Still not a great argument. The fact that this stuff exists, that I can look out into the world and there are things, and that the world exists, and the more I study the science of it, and the more I study the consistency of the world. I was at the preacher's meeting, and Toby Miller was talking about this show on the Discovery Channel, or one of those scientific shows, and it was from an atheistic background, and they were talking about how amazing it was that all these things just happened to come together all at once, and they were talking about the magnificence of the universe, and how if the earth was tilted just slightly off kilter where it is, then our seasons wouldn't exist, and the waves of the ocean wouldn't be what they are. We'd either have way too big of waves and they destroy parts of the shore areas, or we wouldn't have any at all, and the oceans would stagnate, and the fish would die, and we'd all die too. And I remember Toby just talking about this and how amazing it was, and we were like, "You're watching the show?" And he's like, "Yes, it's incredible." Because they don't know why. They don't know why this is the case. And I do. And I thought that was incredible. Why the dog leg? Why do these things exist? Why is the world the way it is? Because God made it that way. And there are times that we come down the line, and maybe in a future years we look back and we say, well, there it is. Well, there it is. Well, we don't always get that. We don't always get answers to all of our problems and all the things that go on, but we do get some of them. And we can look back as well as we are able to, and we can see how God was working. And I have loved studying the Old Testament. I have loved it because I can look back and I can see how God is moving and the things that God is doing. And the more I understand the Old Testament, the better I understand the New Testament, and the better I understand my own life. And the better I understand how God is working, whether it is then or it is now. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul tells those in Philippi to meditate. Meditate on certain things. He says in verse 8, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." Consider the work of God, for instance. And I wonder if Paul doesn't. The fact that he tells these brethren in Philippi to meditate on things that are praiseworthy and worthwhile and lovely and noble, that tells me that Paul took his time with a sunrise or a sunset. That Paul learned how to appreciate the magnificence of God and how he created this world. There is not a lot in this world created by man that's praiseworthy. Most of what we do is a destruction of what is beautiful and what is great about this world. But what God creates, what God has created, and what God continues to bring us through, that matters. And so he says there in verse 13, that was a long way around to get there, wasn't it? Like a dog leg. Almost like it was planned. Who knows? Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? And the question really is, why do you keep trying? Why do we keep trying? When God's plans are A, why do we try and keep going for X, or Y, or Z? Why do we try to replace it with B? Why do we try to change or modify or complicate that which God has created? And if he's created it crooked, he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's accomplishing and what he's trying to engender. And then in verse 14, he wants you to meditate on these things, consider these things. And he brings the culmination here in verse 14. If verse 13 is true, that God is capable of making things crooked as he appoints them to be crooked, and you can do nothing about them. Notice verse 14, his application, or the conclusion he draws. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. There's that word again. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. We have this real problem. We are constrained to the present. I can only experience my life as it is right now within a very small field of vision. And that's the extent of it. I don't see things going on the other side of the world. I don't even see things going on past those trees over there. Any number of things could be happening over there, and I would be entirely unaware of it. But God is not. And if I believe that's true, that there are things that God has made crooked, and I can't straighten, and there are things that are out of my control, that aren't intended to be in my control, then why do I sit back, and this seems to be an obvious answer to the hypocritical, why me, God, when things go wrong? When things go wrong, what should I do? I should consider. I should think about it. And the first place I should go is, am I doing anything wrong? Is there something I could do better? Right? Effectively, I'm asking, am I doing this to myself, or am I bringing this on myself in some way? How's my relationship with God? And if all of those things check out, then I need to keep going. Because if God is in control, which we argue that He is, then He is either bringing us to this, or He's going to bring us through this. And He's okay with us being there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, he says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now, if Solomon had these words in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, he would have looked at the people, as he is right now, and he would have said, wait, do you believe 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13? Do you believe that? That God, while He may bring you to a problem, He is not going to test you or tempt you in anything that you are not able to handle, but will provide a way of escape for you. Do you believe that? And people would, of course, as we would today, we'd say yes, and we would say amen. Certainly, that is absolutely the way it is. But when we are in those tests, and we are in those trials, and we are in those difficulties, we don't remember verse 13, do we? Of either 1 Corinthians 10 or of Ecclesiastes 7. Consider the work of God. What He has made straight, what He has made crooked, we cannot make straight. We are not able to change what God has ordained things to be. Why do these things happen to me? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, Job would say. Job had a very, very good understanding as far as it pertained to his place in the world. And that seems to be the overarching theme of the book of Ecclesiastes, not in the spiritual concept, obviously, but that if we really believe these things, do they play out in our lives? Because that is something that can be tested. Not whether what we believe in is true, not intrinsically anyway in this case. He's not testing that. He's not theologically going through the concepts of God. He's merely taking something that people believe and asking if they believe it to the degree they will live it. Does it change the way we act and the way we live and the choices that we make? Because if it doesn't, do we truly believe the thing to begin with? And now he's getting to a really hard question. If we say we believe it, does it affect our lives? Does it change the way we talk about God, to others, about our situations? If we believe that God is capable, has control over things, and can bring us through and promises to help us through, then why do we get so stressed out? Why do we get so upset? Why does it affect us so much? When the New Testament writers, when the apostles, they feel constrained by persecution, they resolve to pray to God. And they pray for boldness, not for the persecution to go away. And they set the example of dealing with this persecution. And when they come out on the other side and they're released by the Sanhedrin a number of times, the council of Jewish leadership, and sometimes they've been beaten, they've been threatened, they've been told to quit or they're going to suffer worse. And what's their attitude when they leave? They rejoiced. They praised God that they could experience such problems because it established that they were in Him, that they could suffer for righteousness' sake. And that is a difficult perspective to get to. But that's where we need to move. That's the direction we need to go. To where we can understand the thing that Ecclesiastes is telling us all along. Don't think you will do anything better than God. Don't think you know more than the Lord of heaven and earth. And that's where he gets to in verse 15. Notice he says, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish, nor should you die before your time. Why should you die before your time? Verse 18, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. Now it comes to an interesting conclusion at the end of verse 18 there. He who fears God will escape them all. And notice in the beginning of 18, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other. These two things we need to understand, we need to grasp, and we need to make use of. He says, don't go overboard. And when he says overly righteous, he's not saying that there is an extreme of being righteous. Because righteousness has its limit in perfection. There's no more righteousness than perfection. And Jesus exemplified that. What he's saying is don't go beyond righteousness, which was a very, very big deal, especially for the Pharisees in the days of Jesus. And you even had some of the rabbis already starting to do this. To go beyond God's righteousness and to apply laws that had no place in the world. And what some would do would be to go the other direction, and they would take wickedness to its extreme. Not that he's saying it's okay to be wicked, but especially from an earthly perspective, he says, it is dangerous. It is physically dangerous to go to the extreme of wickedness. Most people will indulge in bouts of wickedness under heaven, right? That is to say, people who aren't concerned with their future in eternity. But we see the dangers when that is not culled physically. People who overdose on drugs. People who do crazy things and get caught and go to prison or get killed in the process. He says, be reasonable, verse 20, right? Be reasonable when you're talking about being under the sun. He says, verse 19, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. And again, he's talking oftentimes about being wise is better than being a ruler of the city, being rich, being wealthy, being famous, being any of those things. I'd rather be wise, Solomon says, because it will keep me from all of these awful things that could befall me, at least a lot of the awful things that I bring upon myself. In verse 20 he says, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. When he talks about consider, he's talking about considering your works, which is what I titled the section. Consider your works. And that's in contrast to God. Because he started with God. This is what God is capable of. This is what God does. This is how we should trust God. And then look at what you do. What do you accomplish? And if we're really fair, a whole lot of nothing, or worse than nothing. We succeed at sin. We succeed at failing miserably. Occasionally we succeed at a few good things, but they do not outweigh the bad. And especially under the old law, Solomon would be exceedingly aware of that. Exceedingly aware, because the old law was designed to show that, to demonstrate the wickedness of man. In verse 21 he says, also do not take to heart everything people say. That's great advice, just in general. And then he tells you why, lest you hear your servant cursing you. And he says, don't get upset when you hear your servant cursing you. This is from a practical side. Your temptation is to immediately get upset about that. He shouldn't be doing that. He shouldn't say that. Well, it's unlikely you were meant to hear that, frankly. If you walk in on somebody upset about something, they might be just yelling about stuff. Yelling about things because they're emotional, because they're upset. But then in verse 22 he says, for many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. He says, why are you expecting a higher standard from your servant than from yourself? But you have power over that servant, and so he should not be saying that. But who else have you cursed? The Proverbs writer would say, the psalmist would say, God above. Oftentimes God calls into question people's attitudes when they curse God. In verse 23 he says, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise. Many people have said that. Now, to be fair, Solomon is wiser than all the people on the earth at that time and arguably would ever exist. Minus Jesus, I would say. But he is still not wiser than God. And if he is the wisest of us, and he's not wiser than God, none of us stand a chance. We are much less wise than God, and he is exceedingly less wise than God. He says in verse 24, at the end of verse 23, he said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Understanding things. Now, I could consider things, but I had to realize, and that's part of the wisdom of Solomon, I had to realize what I didn't know. And that's a hard thing to gather, hard thing to glean, hard thing to accept. That there are things that we don't know. That's a hard thing for us to accept when it comes to other people, too. If you've ever had someone ask you questions, especially about the Bible, you want to give them an answer, especially when it seems like an important answer. When it seems like an important thing, you want to give them an answer, but you need to make sure that answer is correct. Because what Chris Reno believes or thinks is true, what he considers to be right, isn't necessarily right. And what any of us at all ever consider to be right isn't necessarily right. But what the Bible teaches, that is what is right. And he says, it was far from me to understand this. I really wanted to understand this. Well, too bad, Solomon. You don't get to understand that. And that's okay. Verse 24, as for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? This sounds very much like the end of the book of Job and the questions that God asked Job when he decides finally to get upset with God and to challenge God and God's ability to torment him in such a way. And God says, who are you? Who are you? And I almost get the feeling like the moment this discussion begins, Job is sorry he said anything. And I'm sure all of us have been there with somebody along the way. Just sorry I opened this can of worms. Verse 25, I applied my heart to know. This is how committed he is to understanding this thing. And how do you suppose this is going to work out? He is determined to understand it. He has set his heart to do it. He wants to be wise. To search and seek out wisdom and to reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Keep going, verse 27. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. So he's doing it logically, that's what he's saying. I'm doing it systematically. I want to understand this thing. I'm gonna run down the course. I'm going to go one thing at a time, and I'm going to apply it as is appropriate, like a math equation. Whenever you help a kid to figure out a math problem, most of the time, if it's any kind of advanced, it's just a problem that they missed something along the way. That they forgot to carry a 1. Are you kidding me? You get the answer wrong because you forgot to carry a 1? But when you're banking, 1s matter. 1s add up. And so it does in equations. And that's what he's doing. He's being succinct. He's being consistent. He's trying to put all of his ducks in a row. But he doesn't realize he's not dealing with ducks, but with cats or children. They don't get in rows. Not without a lot of training. Like herding cats is dealing with the wisdom of God. He says, which my soul still seeks. And what's his result? Verse 28. But I cannot find. So how much is he committed to understanding this wisdom, to understand human purpose and commitment and how the ways of God are different than the ways of man? He consistently and thoroughly has committed himself to it, and that must be frustrating if you have ever tried to understand something. You've ever tried to learn something, maybe a foreign language, or maybe algebra, or maybe counting, I don't know, and you just struggled with it. And it may have been a hiccup on your own part, or maybe in the teacher, or maybe in the subject matter. But you just couldn't manage it. It is frustrating. I'll tell you, when I was in preaching school, we were learning Hebrew. Learning Hebrew is really complicated, first because Hebrew reads from right to left instead of left to right, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you're trained and all your life you've read from left to right, reading from right to left is a very, very big thing. And one of the fellow students there, he did not get that from the first few lessons. And so I think he took 4 or 5 tests, not knowing that you read from right to left. And it was frustrating, and it drove him crazy. And we finally figured out what it was. We finally figured out that it's this very simple thing. He was just reading the wrong direction. And then he became a really great, he became one of the best individuals in the class, mostly because of the time he spent to understand these things already. Then that simple thing turned on an entire understanding that he gained. But how frustrated he was, and how frustrated you've likely been in something. And imagine Solomon in a position where he understands so many things, and people even come to him. The Queen of Sheba herself, individuals from all around the world come to him for answers and wisdom, to know how smart he is, and he gives them all answers, and they go away astonished. And this one thing he cannot understand, because it's not meant for him to understand. Because it's not for him to understand. And that can be frustrating. But I cannot find out. One man, I love this, one man amongst 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. He says, these things that I cannot find out. Of all the people, if I polled 1,000 people, 1,000 men, I might find one that understood things. And if I polled 1,000 women, now remember the women that he would generally be dealing with. Remember, he's got 300 wives and 500 concubines. So that's 800 of the women he'd be normal in communication with right now. He doesn't find a one of them. He says, truly this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. What if you tie this back to verse 13? We argue that God made us crooked, and we've been trying to straighten ourselves. And maybe the problem is that we've perceived that the crookedness is in the design rather than in the decisions. The very end there in verse 29, he says that God made man upright, which is the exact opposite of crooked. And what does man continue to try to do? To scheme, to get around things. Now, there are times where God's purposes circumvent certain things that man considers important or thinks should be done. There are things, I'm sure, in the Old Testament that didn't make a lot of sense to people. I'm sure in 2 Kings 5, when Naaman comes to the prophet to ask him to heal him of his leprosy, he obviously had an idea. He even says when Gehazi comes out, the man's servant, the prophet's servant comes out to tell him what needs to be done.